At midnight, when the streets outside my Chicago apartment were silent, except for the occasional growl of a passing truck, I found myself driving down the familiar highway toward my parents' house. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. I simply needed to see my mother. Something in me, a restless pull that refused to let me sleep, told me to go back without warning. The moon was hanging low, pale and ghostly, and as I turned onto the dark cul-de-sac where their house sat, I noticed the curtains drawn tight, no light from my father's study, not even the faint blue glow of the television he normally left on all night. It felt wrong, the kind of wrong that made your stomach clench before your mind caught up. I pushed open the front door with my spare key, expecting the familiar creak in the hallway, the smell of my mother's lavender candles. Instead, the air was stale heavy with the scent of bleach and something metallic. I walked straight to the kitchen because that was where my mother always waited for me no matter the hour with tea and leftover pie. What I saw instead stopped me cold. My mother Helen sat hunched over at the table, her robe loose around her shoulders, one hand trembling on a glass of water. Her jaw was swollen, grotesquely bruised, deep purple, tilted at an unnatural angle. Her lips quivered as if she wanted to speak, but the words could not come. For a moment, I didn't breathe. I dropped my bag and rushed to her, but she shook her head violently terrified, as though even my touch might bring more pain. Tears pooled in her eyes and slid down her cheeks, but she still tried to lift her chin to show me she could endure it. My chest constricted in fury and disbelief. I whispered, "Mom, who did this to you?" But her fingers clutched mine with desperate pressure, and she mouthed no sound. Then her phone vibrated on the table, the screen lighting up. I glanced down. It was from my father, Richard. The message read, "Don't wait up. Remember the deal." The words were cold, deliberate, a command rather than an update. I looked at her face again, the broken jaw, and in that instant, the truth screamed louder than any words she could not say. He had done this. My father. The man who used to smile at church gatherings, shake hands at charity dinners, pose in photographs with his arm around my mother as if she were nothing but a polished accessory. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. Then another sound reached me, faint but unmistakable, coming from the tablet left open on the counter. I turned and saw the screen still glowing. It was a live video call. My father's face filled the screen, tanned and smug, his arm around a younger woman whose laugh carried over the connection like broken glass. Behind them stretched the deck of a luxury yacht, white cushions, glasses of champagne, the horizon dark but lit by scattered stars. He looked nothing like a man who had just shattered his wife's jaw. He looked like a king, drunk on power, immune to consequence. The woman kissed his cheek and called him darling, and he laughed as though the world belonged to him. I felt bile rise in my throat. In the kitchen, my mother pressed a trembling hand to her face, eyes cast down, ashamed though she was the victim. The contrast between her suffering and his pleasure was unbearable, like two halves of a nightmare colliding. I gripped the table so hard, my knuckles whitened. Rage coursed through me sharper than any knife. In that moment, I understood this was not a bruise, not a single night gone wrong. This was years of silence, years of control, years of gaslighting wrapped into one horrifying image, my mother broken in the dark while my father celebrated with his mistress on a yacht. The cruelty was not just physical, it was calculated, public, and flaunted. He wanted her hidden, diminished, erased while he paraded his new life above the waves. My heart pounded, and a clarity unlike any I had ever known settled over me. There would be no forgiveness, no compromise, no more silence. Tonight was the night the mask slipped off Richard forever. I wanted to scream, but the sound froze in my throat. My mother's swollen face hovered in front of me like a painting of suffering, the deep purple shadows around her jaw spreading into her neck like spilled ink. She tried to sip water, but the liquid dribbled out the corner of her mouth, sliding down her robe, and still she dabbed at it with trembling fingers, as if to hide the evidence of pain. I whispered again, "Who did this, Mom?" But she only closed her eyes and shook her head hard, eyes flicking toward the hallway like a frightened animal watching for the shadow of its predator. That was when I noticed the silence of the house. Normally, my father's footsteps would thunder on the upstairs floorboards, or the low murmur of his late-night television would echo down the hall. Tonight, nothing. It was as though he had stripped the house of sound, leaving only her broken breathing and my pounding heart. Then my gaze fell back to the tablet on the counter, still showing the yacht party. Richard's voice drifted through the kitchen speakers, smug and resonant, laughing at some joke Vanessa whispered in his ear. I watched him clink glasses with her, watched him tilt his head back and drink, while my mother pressed a hand to her shattered jaw. The fury in me built like pressure in a sealed pipe. I reached for the tablet and turned the volume up just enough for my mother to hear. She flinched. She knew his voice even in her sleep. He was celebrating while she bled. I muted it quickly, guilt stabbing me for causing her more fear, but the image on the screen seared itself into my mind. I stepped closer to her, took her cold hand in mine. "Mom, we can go," I whispered. "I can take you to the hospital, to the police, anywhere." She squeezed my hand in reply, but then shook her head again with desperate urgency. Her eyes pleaded with me not to move her, not to call anyone. The fear was deeper than injury. It was the fear of retaliation, the fear of what Richard would do if she disobeyed. That was when her phone lit up again with another message. This time, it wasn't just a command. It read, "Keep your mouth shut. Remember what happens when you don't." The words stabbed at me with such clarity I nearly threw the phone across the room. He wasn't just warning her, he was threatening her with more. My fists clenched. I had handled violent men before in my job as an investigator, but nothing compared to seeing it pressed into your own mother's skin. I pulled my chair close, my voice low and steady, trying to calm the fire roaring in my chest. "Mom, listen to me. He's not here. He can't stop us right now." But she shook her head violently and tried to scribble something on the napkin near her. Her writing was jagged letters slanting wildly from the pain in her hand. She wrote one word, "Cameras." My heart slammed. Cameras in the house. He was watching. Suddenly, the air felt heavier, as if his gaze might be crawling over us even now. I glanced around the corners of the kitchen, at the smoke detector above the stove, at the small black dot near the bookshelf. My blood chilled. He had turned their home into a cage. Every move recorded, her silence guaranteed. Gaslighting was not enough for him. He needed surveillance proof of his dominance. I swallowed hard, leaning closer so the cameras might not catch my lips. "We'll find them," I mouthed. "We'll tear everyone down." She shook her head again, but I saw a flicker of relief, like a candle guttering in the wind. I reached into my bag and pulled out my small pocket camera, snapping a photo of her injuries, then another of the phone message. She tried to stop me, her eyes wide with terror, but I pressed her hand gently. "Mom, this is the last time he does this. I promise." In the distance outside the kitchen window, I saw the faint glow of a neighbor's porch light flicker on, then off. The night was deep, the world asleep, but in that silence I felt the truth pressing down on me. My father had broken my mother's jaw and left her alone in the dark, and now he was out on a yacht celebrating with champagne. That was not just betrayal. That was cruelty sharpened into spectacle. I held her close, careful not to touch her face, and whispered, "I'm not a child anymore. He doesn't get to win this time." The longer I stared at that tablet screen, the more grotesque the contrast became, as though the universe itself was mocking us. On one side of the counter, my mother hunched in her robe. Jaw shattered every breath, strained her hands, shaking as she tried to keep her dignity, even in silence. On the other side, the glowing glass rectangle displayed my father Richard, tanned and broad-shouldered, his tailored shirt open at the collar, a diamond watch flashing beneath the decklights of a luxury yacht. He lifted his glass to the camera, as if to toast me, as if he knew I would see. Beside him, Vanessa Younger, glamorous in a red dress that clung to her body, leaned in and whispered in his ear. Her laugh was shrill and cruel, and I watched her smear lipstick against his cheek while he smirked like a king. The waves behind them gleamed silver under moonlight, the kind of scene travel magazines sell as paradise, and yet it was my private hell. My eyes kept shifting between my mother's broken body and the yacht scene, and the rage building in me made my fingers tremble. It was as if Richard had orchestrated this theater of humiliation, leaving her here in darkness with bones broken, while he flaunted his new life broadcast for anyone daring to look. I thought of the years of church dinners where he clasped Helen's shoulder and called her his anchor of the charity galas, where he pretended to be the generous patriarch. It had all been a costume, a mask painted carefully over the monster beneath. And now, that mask was gone. He wanted her diminished, silenced, erased, so he could shine alone in the glitter of false love and stolen wealth. My mother tried to push the tablet away, but I grabbed it and studied every detail. The yacht's name painted on the side in gold letters, the champagne brand, the camera angle that suggested one of his cronies was filming. He wasn't hiding, he was documenting. That was the real cruelty. He wanted evidence of his triumph, a permanent record of his betrayal. I clenched my teeth, my jaw aching in sympathetic pain to hers. He had escalated. This wasn't just private violence anymore. This was spectacle. And if he thought fear would keep me quiet, he had forgotten who I had become. I had investigated men like him, men who thought money could bend the law and fists could erase the truth. But this was different because it was my father and my mother, my blood, my home. That made the rage purer, sharper. I bent close to Helen again, whispered so low the cameras might not catch. He's laughing while you bleed. Do you see? He thinks we're powerless. Her eyes welled and a tear slid down, but she nodded faintly. For the first time that night, I saw something beyond fear in her gaze. A spark. She was battered, broken, but she was still alive, and in that small nod, I felt her hand me permission. The tablet screen froze suddenly, the signal dropping, and his face lingered in pixelated blur, frozen in that arrogant grin. I stared at it until the screen went black. The silence that followed was thick, choking. My heart pounded like a drumbeat. That image, my father with champagne on a yacht while my mother held her broken jaw, would burn itself into my mind forever, the exact moment when something inside me hardened into steel. There would be no more waiting, no more hoping he might change, no more bargaining with fear. Tonight was the line in the sand, and I knew with a clarity sharper than a blade that I would destroy Richard's mask, tear down the empire he built on silence, and drag every secret of his into the light. I wish I could say that night was the first time I saw my mother injured, but the truth is, bruises were part of my childhood wallpaper. I grew up measuring fear not by clocks, but by sounds, the slam of the front door, when my father Richard came home late, the sharp crack of glass against tile, the muffled whimper behind a locked bathroom door. As a child, I learned to listen for the shift in his voice, that low growl he reserved for Helen when no one else was around, the tone that turned dinners into landmines. He was a master of appearances, always crisp suits, perfect smiles, at church donations large enough to buy him applause. Yet in our house, he ruled by silence and correction. If anyone asked about the bruises on my mother's arms, he would chuckle and say she was clumsy. She fell into the cabinet. She tripped on the stairs, and he said it with such confidence that even neighbors doubted their own eyes. That is the essence of gaslighting, bending reality until truth itself feels flimsy. As a little girl, I sometimes believed him ashamed of doubting, but deep down, the pit of my stomach always knew. I remember one night at 11 years old, I crept downstairs and found my mother pressing frozen peas to her cheek, tears dripping into the sink. When she saw me, she whispered, "It's nothing, baby. Go back to bed." And I obeyed because I was small and powerless. But in that moment, I also made a secret vow. Someday, I would not go back to bed. Someday I would stand between them. That vow shaped everything. While other kids planned dances and parties, I buried myself in books about law and justice, about women who broke cycles of silence. At 16, I took my first self-defense class, fists shaking but determined. By 21, I was in a criminal justice program earning top marks in investigative procedures. My father scoffed when I told him I was applying to a private investigator's firm after graduation. He sneered, said no one would take a woman seriously in that field. That sneer only fueled me. I built a reputation piecing together financial fraud cases, domestic surveillance, tracking hidden assets. Every file I opened was secretly practice for him. I documented meticulously, learned how to preserve chain of custody, how to make evidence unshakable in court, My mother watched me grow with quiet pride, but also with fear. She begged me more than once not to provoke Richard, not to dig too deep. She thought survival meant silence. I thought survival meant preparation. Over the years, we lived a balancing act, her covering bruises with makeup and scarves, me collecting skills like weapons locked away until the day I would need them. That night in the kitchen, staring at her broken jaw, I realized the day had come. The training, the cases, the notebooks filled with details about abusers I had investigated, all of it was rehearsal for this moment. I was not just Helen's daughter anymore. I was her shield, her witness, her advocate. And I was Richard's reckoning. By the time dawn's first gray light touched the curtains, I knew there was no turning back, and the first call I made was to Mark Sullivan, the only lawyer I trusted. Mark had been a family friend once before Richard's empire swallowed everything, and I knew if anyone could help me structure a case, it was him. I spoke in clipped tones, giving him only the facts, and within an hour he arrived with a leather briefcase and a face carved with concern. He looked at Helen, her jaw bound in a makeshift sling of cloth, and shook his head. "This ends now," he said, and I felt the words like an oath. Together, we sat at the kitchen table, the same place where my father had once dictated silence, and we began building what I called the box. It wasn't a literal box yet, more a concept, but it would become the arsenal that dismantled Richard's mask. Step 1 was documentation. I had already photographed Helen's injuries and the threatening texts. Mark showed me how to timestamp the files, back them up to encrypted drives, and store duplicates in his office safe. Step 2 was medical. Helen resisted, terrified Richard would find out, but I convinced her, holding her hand as we drove to a discreet clinic across town where the doctor examined her and wrote a report so detailed no judge could dismiss it. Every fracture, every bruise was cataloged in clinical language that stripped away Richard's lies. Step 3 was financial. I knew from my own investigations that men like my father rarely kept their hands clean. With Mark's contacts, we traced shell companies registered under aliases but linked by IP addresses to Richard's office. Transactions to offshore accounts surfaced, including large wire transfers to a name matching Vanessa. The pattern was unmistakable. He had been funneling money to maintain his mistress while claiming household finances were tight, another layer of control over Helen. Step 4 was surveillance. Helen's napkin warning about cameras was not paranoia. I searched the house carefully, unscrewing smoke detectors, checking vents, and in 3 rooms I found small black devices wired to a remote server. We dismantled them, photographed them, and Mark arranged for a tech expert to certify their existence as evidence of coercive control. Each step added another brick to the box. But it wasn't just evidence we were gathering, it was resolve. Every document we printed, every file we stored felt like reclaiming oxygen stolen for years. Helen still trembled, still whispered that Richard would crush us, but I saw sparks of defiance each time she watched Mark slip a paper into the growing folder. At one point, she whispered, "What if he destroys us?" And I answered, "Then we destroy him first." The words hung in the air, sharp and electric, and Mark nodded grimly. We agreed on strategy first, secure a protective order for Helen, then prepare civil filings, then coordinate with the district attorney once financial crimes were strong enough. Richard's reputation would not save him from a trail of hard evidence. For the first time in decades, my mother had allies at her side instead of chains around her voice. The box was no longer theoretical. It was real heavy, undeniable, and each page added to it was another crack in Richard's armor. It didn't take long for Richard to sense the shift. He always smelled resistance the way sharks scent blood and water. 3 days after Helen's medical report was filed, a black car slid up the driveway and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, carrying a folder embossed with the crest of my father's law firm. He didn't ask permission to enter, just handed me the letter with a smug half-smile. It was a cease and desist, accusing me of harassment, defamation, and trespass. The language dripped with arrogance, claiming Helen's injuries were self-inflicted and that my interference threatened family unity. I read every line, my hands steady, though my stomach churned. Helen sat rigid beside me, fear etched into her face, as though the paper itself carried Richard's fists. I looked at the lawyer and said evenly, "Tell Richard he should save his stationery. He'll need it when he's indicted." The man blinked, surprised, then muttered something about consequences before retreating to his car. That evening, the phone rang. Richard's voice filled the kitchen like smoke, smooth and venomous. "You think you're clever, Claire, building your little file. You're just like your mother. Weak, always reaching above your station." I gripped the receiver, forcing my tone to remain cold. "Weak is hiding on a yacht while your wife bleeds." His laugh came low and cruel. "She fell. She always falls. And you're making a mistake. I record everything, remember that. Every word you speak can be turned." Then the line went dead, but his echo lingered like a poison in the room. Minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A photo of my apartment door time-stamped 20 minutes prior. He had someone watching me. My throat tightened, but I forced calm into my voice when I told Helen. "It's intimidation," I said. "Just intimidation. He wants us to flinch." She whispered. "He doesn't bluff." And she was right. That night, she found a dead bird on the porch, its neck snapped, laid neatly on the welcome mat like an omen. I took photos logged and added it to the box. Each threat he sent only added to his downfall. Yet the pressure mounted. News articles began surfacing about Richard's philanthropy, painting him as a community hero. Anonymous online accounts spread rumors that I had a history of mental illness, that Helen was addicted to pills, lies seeded by his PR machine. It was textbook gaslighting scaled to the public stage. Neighbors averted their eyes when I walked past, murmuring sympathy for Richard, poor man, with a hysterical wife and a vindictive daughter. But I had built my life in shadows of doubt, and I knew how to turn perception. Every smear he tried, I documented. Every whisper of slander I traced back to his network. Mark kept assuring me the louder he gets, the closer he feels the walls closing in. Still, the nights grew heavier. I checked the locks 3 times, kept pepper spray under my pillow, slept with my shoes by the bed. Richard wanted me rattled, and I refused to give him the satisfaction, but I would be lying if I said my hands never shook. The worst moment came when Vanessa herself texted from an unknown number a photo of her sipping champagne captioned, "Enjoy babysitting your broken doll." The cruelty made my vision blur. Helen saw it too, and for the first time anger flashed across her battered face instead of fear. She whispered, "He thinks he's untouchable." And I answered, "Then we'll prove him wrong." The threats kept coming until one night there was a knock at my apartment door, long after midnight, the same cursed hour when this had all begun. My pulse raced as I looked through the peephole, half expecting one of Richard's men, but instead I saw a face I hadn't glimpsed in years. Frank Donovan. My father's former business partner stood there hunched in a worn jacket, eyes darting nervously down the hall. I opened the door a crack, suspicion flaring, but he whispered urgently, "Please, let me in. He'll kill me if he knows I'm here." Against my better judgment, I pulled him inside and locked the door. Frank looked like a man crushed by guilt, his hands trembling as he pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. "He said I can't sleep anymore, not after what I've seen. Your father isn't just beating your mother, he's bleeding everyone dry." He shoved the drive toward me. I plugged it into my laptop, and what unfolded across the screen made my breath catch. Bank statements, offshore accounts, shell corporations with names that looked legitimate until you traced them back to Richard's office IP. Payments funneled through layered transfers, bribes masked as consulting fees, and at the center of it all, wire transfers to Vanessa disguised as marketing expenses for a non-existent firm. It was a labyrinth of deceit, but to me it was familiar territory. I had unraveled cases like this for strangers. Now I was staring at my own father's empire of rot. Frank buried his face in his hands. He told me Richard forced him to sign false audits to cover up safety violations in construction projects, even after accidents maimed workers. He confessed that hush money had been paid to families that Richard laughed while men bled on job sites, calling it cheaper than fixing the flaws. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just domestic abuse or infidelity. This was systemic cruelty, a network of exploitation stretching far beyond our family walls. Helen's broken jaw was one fracture in a body of crimes that spanned cities. I asked Frank why now, why risk everything to bring this to me, and his voice cracked as he said, "Because I saw your mother last week." I saw her smile with teeth missing, and I realized he'd do the same to anyone, even me, if I stopped obeying. I couldn't carry it anymore. He begged me for protection, for anonymity, but he also gave me something more powerful than fear: corroboration. For the first time, I had an insider willing to testify. I copied every file, secured it in the box, and promised him that if he stood with us, we could bring Richard down not just as a husband, but as a criminal. Frank trembled but nodded. He said he couldn't live in silence anymore. As he left my apartment, I felt the air shift. Until then, it had been my mother and me against a monster. Now we had a witness, a partner, a man who had built Richard's empire, now ready to burn it down from the inside. I closed the laptop and stared at the mountains of evidence piling higher. This was no longer a family tragedy. It was a federal case waiting to ignite. Mark arranged the meeting in his office, a neutral ground of mahogany walls and the faint scent of old leather. But the moment Richard walked in with his entourage, the room tilted as if poisoned. He wore a tailored navy suit tie, knotted with meticulous precision, and the arrogance in his stride filled every corner. He didn't even glance at Helen, who sat rigid beside me with her face still bruised from the fractures, her jaw wired shut by surgeons. Instead, he let his eyes sweep the shelves of law books as if bored by the proceedings. Then he smirked and said, "Claire playing detective again." I clenched my hands beneath the table nails digging into my palms, but my voice came steady. "We're not playing. We have evidence." Richard chuckled low, a sound I had grown up fearing, and tapped the folder in front of him. "Evidence? You mean photographs of your clumsy mother falling into cabinets. Doctors will say anything if you pay them." My mother flinched at the words, but I leaned forward and slid our folder across the table. Inside were printed bank statements, screenshots of wire transfers, copies of shell company registrations, and photos of hidden cameras pulled from vents in the house. His eyes flicked down once, then back up, still calm, but a twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. He pushed the folder back with 2 fingers as though it were contaminated. "Do you think a judge will believe you over me?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I built half this city. My donations keep the hospitals running. People know my name. They know hers, too." I shot back and I gestured to Helen. For the first time, she lifted her chin, her voice hoarse through the pain as she whispered, "I am not clumsy." He broke me. The silence that followed was electric. Even Mark's assistant froze with her pen mid-air. Richard's jaw tightened, his charm cracking just slightly, and then he leaned back with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Careful," he said softly. "Perjury is a crime." I leaned across the table until my face was inches from his. "So is perjury, fraud, assault, tax evasion, and coercive control. And we have a witness who worked beside you." His brows lifted, surprise flickering before he masked it. "Frank," I said deliberately. He stiffened. For the first time in my life, I saw fear ripple through my father's eyes, fleeting but real. He recovered quickly, sneering, "Frank's a drunk." "No court will trust him." "We'll see," I replied. The meeting ended with his lawyers shuffling him out, but as he reached the door, he turned back, eyes narrowing at me. "You think you're strong now, but you're still mine, Claire. You'll always be mine." I felt Helen shudder beside me, but I stood tall, meeting his gaze without flinching. Not anymore. That exchange, brief but raw, crystallized everything. He still believed ownership was eternal, that fear was his leash, but I knew the leash had snapped. His words no longer chained me. They fueled me. And as the door shut behind him, I swore to myself that the next time I faced Richard, it would not be across a table. It would be in court under oath with the world watching. The courthouse smelled of dust and coffee, a blend of bureaucracy and nerves, and as I walked Helen through the long marble corridor, I felt her arm tremble against mine. She wore a simple dress, her jaw still bound with wires, but her eyes carried a determination I had never seen in her before. The gallery was already full when we entered, reporters hunched with notepads, neighbors craning for a glimpse of scandal business associates, pretending curiosity instead of dread. At the front of the room, Richard sat at the defense table, perfectly composed in a gray suit. Vanessa, a shadow 2 rows behind him, her lips painted the same crimson as the dress she had worn on the yacht. He didn't look at Helen. He didn't look at me. He stared at the judge with the calm arrogance of a man convinced the system belonged to him. Mark rose first, presenting the box. "Peace, by piece, he laid it before the court, photographs of Helen's injuries with medical reports stapled behind them, text messages threatening silence, photographs of hidden cameras removed from vents, and finally the financial trail. Layered shell companies' wire transfers to offshore accounts, payments to Vanessa disguised as consulting fees. The judge, a woman with stern glasses and a reputation for skepticism, leaned forward at each new exhibit. Richard's lawyers objected furiously, claiming fabrication distortion bias, but the evidence was too clean, the chain of custody too precise. Then came Frank. He shuffled to the witness stand, his voice shaky at first, but soon words poured like confession. He told the court about falsified audits, about bribes to inspectors after construction accidents, about hush money pressed into grieving families' hands. He said Richard once told him it was cheaper to pay for funerals than to fix safety violations. The courtroom erupted, gasps echoing against high ceilings, the judge banging her gavel for silence. Richard's face remained calm, but his jaw tightened and sweat began to bead along his hairline. Then it was Helen's turn. She rose slowly, her frame fragile yet unbreakable, and walked to the stand. The bailiff helped her swear in. For a long moment she said nothing, only looked at the gallery, at neighbors who once believed Richard's lies, at strangers leaning forward with pity. Then she whispered through wired teeth, "I am not clumsy. He broke me." Gasps filled the air again. She went on, each word strained but deliberate, describing nights of fists, the humiliation of excuses, the silence forced by fear. She spoke of cameras in the house, of being watched even as she slept, of the terror of hearing him laugh with another woman while her bones ached. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she didn't falter. And when she finished, the room was still the kind of silence that thunders louder than noise. Richard finally snapped. He slammed his hand on the table, rising, shouting that she was a liar, a hysteric, that Frank was a thief, that I was a traitor. His voice cracked, the mask slipping, and the gallery watched the man they once admired unravel into rage. The judge's gavel cracked down again. "Order," she demanded. "Sit down, Mr. Callahan." But he kept shouting until two bailiffs stepped forward and forced him back into his seat. That was the moment the power shifted, visible to everyone. Richard wasn't untouchable anymore. He was exposed, angry, desperate. The district attorney, who had been observing quietly, rose and addressed the bench. "Given the testimony and the financial evidence, the state is opening a criminal investigation into charges of assault, fraud, money laundering, and coercive control." Murmurs swept the room like wildfire. Richard's lawyers scrambled, whispering frantically, but the damage was done. He wasn't the king on the yacht anymore. He was a man cornered, stripped of his illusion. Helen leaned back in her chair, tears glistening, and for the first time in decades, I saw relief flicker across her face. My own chest felt lighter, not with victory yet, but with certainty. Justice was no longer a dream. It was in motion, unstoppable. The morning after the hearing, the headlines were everywhere. Richard Callahan under investigation for fraud and assault, his photo splashed across news sites that once praised him as a philanthropist. The phone in my apartment buzzed non-stop with reporters seeking comment, but I ignored them, letting the tide of truth run its course. That afternoon, federal agents executed search warrants at his offices, seizing computers and ledgers, while police served him with an emergency protective order forbidding contact with Helen or me. For a man who once commanded entire boardrooms with a glance, being escorted from his glass tower in handcuffs became the image that defined him. Banks froze his accounts within days. Properties he thought were shielded by shell companies were traced and locked. Yachts, impounded real estate liens filed. I read the notices with a quiet sense of vindication. Each page was a nail in the coffin of his empire. Vanessa moved quickly to save herself. Within a week, she sat in the district attorney's office offering cooperation in exchange for leniency. I imagined her painted lips curling as she slid documents across the table, exposing Richard's offshore accounts, the codes he used, the men he bribed. Loyalty had never been her currency. Survival was. For Helen, the shift was surreal. Neighbors who once whispered lies about her now brought casseroles and apologies. Some meant it, some didn't, but she received them all with a quiet dignity, refusing to let bitterness corrode her. When she walked into the grocery store with her chin high, people no longer saw a clumsy woman. They saw a survivor whose truth had broken a man's empire. Richard sat in jail awaiting arraignment denied bail after prosecutors presented the breadth of his financial crimes alongside the threat he posed to witnesses. I attended the hearing watching him in the orange jumpsuit, his hair disheveled, his eyes dull. He glanced at me once, a flicker of the old arrogance trying to surface, but I met it without blinking. He looked away first. Mark leaned over and whispered, "That's the beginning of the end." Civil suits followed swiftly, families of injured workers, creditors defrauded by his schemes, even shareholders who had been lied to. Each case added weight to the avalanche already crushing him. His attorneys filed motions, tried to suppress evidence, but every attempt crumbled against the mountain of documentation in the box and Frank's testimony. The man who once believed he owned the system now sat trapped inside it, powerless. For me, the most telling moment came not in court, but in the quiet of Helen's kitchen. She was stirring soup slowly, the scent of thyme filling the air, when she paused and said, through her wired jaw, "I don't hear footsteps anymore." At first, I didn't understand. Then, I realized she meant the sound of Richard's heavy tread, the sound that once dictated her every breath. That silence was the purest consequence. It was freedom. Spring arrived quietly with the smell of damp earth and the soft hum of bees in Helen's small backyard, a space Richard had once dismissed as worthless dirt. Now it was ours, tilled with our own hands turned over until the soil yielded to new life. Helen knelt carefully, her jaw healed, but her body still fragile, and pressed tomato seedlings into rows. I followed behind, staking each stem, tying them with twine. The sight of her fingers in the soil, instead of clutching bruises, felt like victory greater than any verdict. We watered in silence until the ground shimmered, then sat on the back step with the late sun washing the yard in gold. Helen's voice was steady as she said, "For the first time, I can taste food without fear." I looked at her and realized freedom wasn't dramatic. It was in the simple things: an unlocked door, an unmonitored night, a meal seasoned with peace instead of dread. My own life shifted too. I left private investigation for strangers and started a foundation for survivors of domestic abuse, naming it after the garden Helen tended. The Callahan Garden Project became a place where women could find legal aid therapy and the assurance they weren't alone. I poured every dollar of restitution Richard was ordered to pay into its work, transforming his cruelty into seeds of resilience. Reporters still called hungry for updates on his trial dates, his appeals, his final sentencing, but I stopped answering. Justice wasn't in the headlines anymore. It was in Helen's laughter when the first ripe tomato burst sweet against her tongue. It was in neighbors stopping by with seedlings instead of rumors. It was in my own reflection each morning, where I no longer saw a daughter trapped by blood, but a woman defined by choice. Richard's empire lay in ruins, his name etched now not in skyscrapers, but in case law about fraud and coercive control. Vanessa vanished into obscurity. Frank found a measure of peace, testifying to help victims of his silence, and Mark continued his work with a fiercer purpose. As for Helen and me, we built something quieter, humbler, but infinitely stronger. Rows of tomatoes, bushes of roses, a kitchen table that finally felt safe. At night, I sometimes heard echoes of Richard's threats, the memory of his voice hissing that I would always be his. But then I'd hear the creak of Helen's chair, the clink of a watering can, the sound of life continuing. And I'd know the truth: we were no longer his anything. We belonged to ourselves, to each other, and to a future untethered from fear. The moral settled like dusk over the Garden family is not the blood that wounds you, but the hands that heal beside you.